In the heart of Lagos, power was a throne only the strongest could claim. It was a game of inheritance, of legacy, and of betrayal. Adanna had played by the rules, working tirelessly by her father's side for years, believing that loyalty and dedication would secure her future. She had sacrificed her youth, her friendships, and even love, all for the empire she helped build. She lived and breathed Adebayo Industries, ensuring its success. But what she failed to realize was that bloodlines were not always bound by fairness. They were bound by patriarchy. Her father, Chief Adebayo, a man respected and feared in equal measure, had called for a meeting that evening. The entire boardroom was filled with high-ranking executives, each waiting to hear the name of the next CEO. Adanna sat at the table, dressed in a sleek African print blazer, her expression composed. But inside, her heart raced. She had earned this moment. She deserved it. Adanna's brother, Tade, lounged lazily in his chair, adjusting his gold wristwatch with the ease of someone who had never known struggle. Unlike Adanna, he had never worked a day in his life, yet he sat there with a smirk, as if he already knew the outcome. She dismissed it. He was not a competitor. He was just her father's spoiled son. No real leader. The meeting began, and Chief Adebayo stood at the head of the table, his agbada flowing regally as he prepared to speak. Silence fell over the room. Adanna straightened her shoulders, ready to receive what was rightfully hers. Her name would be called. This was her destiny. But the words that left her father's lips shattered her entire world. I hereby name Tade Adebayo as the new CEO of Adebayo Industries. A deafening silence engulfed the room before applause erupted. Adanna sat frozen. Her ears rang. Had she heard him correctly? Had her own father, the man she had given her life to, betrayed her? Adanna's breath hitched. The betrayal sliced deeper than any knife. Her father didn't even look at her. Did her years of sacrifice mean nothing? The walls of the boardroom felt like they were closing in, suffocating her. But she wouldn't let them see her break. No, not today. She clenched her fists beneath the table, her nails digging into her palms. They thought they had won. They thought she would bow and accept this injustice. But Adanna was not a woman who stayed down. If they wanted a war, they would get one. Adanna remained seated as the applause thundered around her. Her heart pounded, but her face was unreadable. She could feel the weight of the betrayal pressing down on her, suffocating her. Every handshake Tade received, every congratulatory nod, was another dagger plunged into her back. But amidst the suffocating betrayal, a fire was kindling inside her, a fire that refused to die. She refused to let them bury her. She inhaled sharply, lifting her chin. If they thought she would simply walk away, broken and defeated, they didn't know the kind of woman they had just created. As the meeting concluded, Chief Adebayo walked past Adanna without a second glance, as though she were a shadow, insignificant. The sting was worse than any words he could have spoken. Tade finally turned to her, his grin widening. No hard feelings, sis. It's just business. Adanna's lips curled into a faint smile, one that held no warmth. Oh, Tade, she said softly, tilting her head. Enjoy your moment. Tade chuckled, mistaking her calmness for defeat. But Adanna had already begun forming her plan. As the board members left the room, Adanna finally stood, adjusting her blazer. She walked slowly toward the glass window, looking over the city that was once meant to be hers. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't cry. She would take back everything they stole from her, by any means necessary. Adanna did not go home that night. She drove through the illuminated streets of Lagos, the city's chaos mirroring the storm in her heart. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as thoughts raced through her mind. She had given everything to Adebayo Industries, yet she had been discarded like an afterthought. The betrayal burned, but it also hardened her resolve. If they thought she would disappear into silence, they were wrong. She pulled over by the ocean front, the salty breeze hitting her face. For a moment, she let the pain settle. Only for a moment. Then she took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and made a vow to herself. She would not break. She would not bow. And she would never forgive. Tad might have the title, but he had no vision. Adanna knew the company better than anyone. She understood every deal, every weak link, and every potential downfall. And more than anything, she knew how to bring the empire to its knees. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. If her father had cast her aside, she would build something greater. She would create her own path, one that neither Tade nor Chief Adebayo could control. And when she succeeded, she would make them regret ever underestimating her. Her phone buzzed. A familiar name flashed on the screen. An old ally. A powerful investor who had always respected her mind over her bloodline. She smirked. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Adanna arrived at Adebayo Industries, not as a broken woman, but as a force to be reckoned with. As she stepped out of her car, heads turned. Employees whispered. Everyone had expected her to disappear after the betrayal, but she was here, dressed in power, her heels clicking with purpose. She strode through the grand entrance, past the same board members who had applauded Tade the night before. They pretended not to notice her, but she could feel their nervous glances. Let them wonder. Let them fear. Tade was in her office. The thought made her lips curl into a slow, knowing smile. He had no idea that the war had already begun. Adanna didn't need an announcement. Her presence alone was enough. The air inside the building felt thick, the whispers louder than usual. Security guards stiffened at her approach, unsure whether to stop her or step aside. She ignored them all. She walked directly toward her old office, the office that now belonged to Tade. Her fingers trailed along the glass walls, every step measured, every breath controlled. When she reached the door, she didn't knock. She simply pushed it open. Tade looked up, startled. He hadn't expected her. Not like this. She took a slow step inside, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're early, Adanna," Tade said, masking his discomfort with arrogance. He leaned back in her old chair, acting as if he belonged there. Adanna tilted her head, studying him. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing." Tade's smirk faltered for a second. He knew she wasn't here for pleasantries. Adanna stepped forward, placing both hands on the desk. "Enjoy your victory while it lasts," she said, her voice calm, deliberate. "Because I promise you, Tade, you won't sit here for long." Tade let out a forced chuckle. "You don't have a say in that anymore." Adanna smiled. "That's where you're wrong." She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving Tade gripping the armrests of his stolen throne a little too tightly. Adanna didn't need to argue. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had learned from the best. Revenge is never loud. It is quiet, calculated, ruthless. As she left the building, her phone buzzed. A message from the powerful investor she had spoken to the night before. One word flashed on the screen. "Done." Adanna's smile widened. Tade had no idea what was coming. Tade walked into his office the next morning, confidence oozing from his every step. But something was off. The usual morning greetings from his staff were missing. Instead, there were hushed whispers and stolen glances. He frowned. "What's going on?" No one answered. Then his secretary hesitantly stepped forward, holding out a printed document. Tade snatched it from her hands and read the headline. His blood ran cold. The words on the page burned into Tade's mind. CEO of Rising Star Inc., under investigation for financial misconduct. His name was in bold underlined, impossible to miss. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. This had to be a mistake, a sick joke. But the murmurs around him confirmed otherwise. This wasn't just an accusation. It was already spreading like wildfire. Panic set in. He rushed to his desk, grabbing his phone to call his lawyer. But before he could dial, the door swung open. Adanna stood there. She wasn't angry. She wasn't gloating. She simply smiled. Tough morning? Adanna's voice was smooth, almost kind. Tade shot up from his chair. You did this. Adanna raised an eyebrow. Me? No, Tade. You did this to yourself. He clenched his fists, jaw tightening. He knew how powerful Adanna's connections were. If she had made one call to the right people, this was only the beginning. Adanna leaned forward slightly. I warned you, didn't I? You took everything from me. But you forgot one thing. Tade swallowed. And what's that? Adanna's smile widened. I don't lose. She turned and walked out. Tade sank back into his chair. For the first time, he felt the weight of his stolen throne. And it was crushing him. Tade sat frozen in his chair, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. One article was all it took to plant doubt in the minds of investors, employees, and the board. His phone vibrated. Another message. Then another. Dozens of missed calls. His lawyer's text read, Crisis mode. We need to talk. Now. Tade gritted his teeth. He had to get ahead of this. He grabbed his coat and stormed out of the office. But the moment he stepped into the hallway, he saw it. His employees gathered around a TV screen, watching a breaking news segment. His face was plastered across the screen. The headline? Sources confirm. Tade's dealings under scrutiny. The room fell silent as they turned to look at him. Meanwhile, Adanna sat in her apartment, sipping tea as she watched the news unfold. She had made her move. Now, it was time to watch the pieces fall into place. Her phone buzzed. Chief Adebayo. Adanna! His deep voice rumbled. You did well? She exhaled slowly. This is just the beginning. Adebayo chuckled. I know. The board is already talking. They don't want him to be the face of the company anymore. They need a replacement. Adanna smirked. And let me guess. You have someone in mind? Adebayo's silence was her answer. She had just taken her first step toward reclaiming everything that was stolen from her. By the time Tade reached his lawyer's office, he was seething. Fix this, he barked, slamming his hands on the desk. His lawyer, an older man with years of experience, simply sighed. Tade, listen to me. This is bad. The board is reconsidering your position. Investors are pulling out. And we haven't even seen the worst of it yet. Tade's jaw tightened. I built this company. They wouldn't dare. The lawyer slid a folder across the table. They already are. An emergency board meeting has been called for tomorrow. Tade felt the ground shift beneath him. They were planning to take him down. The next morning, Tade arrived at the company's headquarters, but something felt off. The usual greetings from employees, gone. The respectful nods, vanished. Instead, whispers followed him like shadows. As he stepped onto the executive floor, the boardroom doors were already open. Every seat was filled. Chief Adebayo sat at the head of the table, watching him like a hunter watching prey. Tade straightened his tie. He wouldn't go down without a fight. We need to discuss recent developments. Chief Adebayo began, his voice calm but sharp. The company's reputation is at risk. Tade scoffed. Because of lies and rumors. Adebayo didn't flinch. Instead, he slid a folder across the table. Then, explain this. Tade hesitated before flipping it open. Inside were documents, leaked emails, contracts, financial statements. Evidence. The room was silent. Tade's stomach twisted. Someone had set him up. Effective immediately. Adebayo continued. The board has voted to suspend you from your duties, pending further investigation. Tade shot up from his seat. You can't do this. The room remained unmoved. The decision was final. As security walked in, Tade's fists clenched. He looked around for support, but every face in the room was stone cold. Then, just as he turned toward the door, he caught a glimpse of her. Adanna, standing in the hallway, watching, waiting, winning, and, in that moment, he knew. He had lost. Tade stormed out of the boardroom, his chest heaving. His mind raced. Who betrayed him? How did this happen so fast? The hallway felt endless as he walked through it, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Employees turned away, avoiding his gaze. He was no longer the king of this empire. Then, he saw her, Adanna. She stood at the end of the hallway, calm, composed, and victorious. She didn't have to say a word. Her eyes said everything. The board meeting continued. With Tade gone, Chief Adebayo cleared his throat. The company needs new leadership. Someone capable, resilient, and trustworthy. A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to Adanna. She felt the weight of their gaze, but didn't falter. She had worked too hard for this moment. Adanna, Chief Adebayo said, we believe you are the right person to lead this company forward. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. This was it. Adanna took a deep breath. She looked around the table, at the same board members who once ignored her, at the same people who once sided with Tade. But today, the balance had shifted. If I take this position, she finally said, things will change. No more deception, no more corruption. This company will stand for integrity. Chief Adebayo nodded. That's exactly why we chose you. A murmur of agreement rippled across the room. For the first time in years, Adanna felt powerful. Tade sat in his office, his fingers tapping furiously on his desk. The walls around him felt suffocating. Everything he built, gone in an instant. But he wasn't finished yet. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. A low, deep voice answered. It's time, Tade whispered. He had one last card to play. Adanna sat in the CEO's office for the first time. The leather chair felt foreign, yet right. She exhaled, running her hands over the polished desk. This was what she fought for. But deep down, she knew. Tade wouldn't let this go. She turned, to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Let him come, she whispered to herself. She was ready. Tade met with a shadowy figure in an underground parking lot. The air was thick with tension. You know what to do, Tade said, slipping an envelope into the man's hand. The man nodded, tucking it into his coat. Adanna thought she won, but the real game was just beginning. Adanna walked into the office the next morning, her head held high. Everything seemed normal. The employees greeted her with respect, and the day had begun like any other. But something was off. Too quiet, too calm. She sat at her desk, unaware that danger lurked just around the corner. Tade leaned back in his chair, watching the news on his phone. The headlines flashed. Corruption scandal! New CEO under investigation. He smirked. His plan was working. With one phone call, he had planted fake evidence against Adanna. Now the walls would close in on her. The office doors burst open. Investigators flooded in. Papers were snatched, computers confiscated. Adanna stood frozen as a man in a dark suit approached. "Miss Adanna, you need to come with us." Her world crumbled, but as she met Tadi's eyes through the glass wall, she saw it. His victory. For now. Adanna sat in the cold, dimly lit interrogation room. The metallic scent of fear and sweat clung to the air. Her fingers twitched on the table's edge, but she held her head high. Across from her, the investigator, a stout man with sharp eyes, slid, a folder toward her. His expression was unreadable. "These documents prove you embezzled funds. How do you explain this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Adanna's breath hitched as she scanned the papers. Bank statements, wire transfers, transactions she never authorized. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Fake documents, planted evidence. Tade had played his hand well. "I didn't do this," she said, keeping her voice steady. "This is a setup." The investigator arched a brow, unimpressed. That's what they all say. Meanwhile, in his sleek high-rise office, Tade leaned back in his chair, a glass of whiskey in hand. He swirled the amber liquid, savoring his victory. "Finally," he muttered, a smug smirk creeping onto his lips. "She's finished." The board had turned against Adanna. They'd voted for her immediate resignation. She was never fit for this position, one of the board members had said earlier. Tade relished every moment of it. He had orchestrated her downfall perfectly. No one would suspect that he was behind the fraud. No one would question the evidence. He lifted his glass in a silent toast to the Queen's fall. Back in the interrogation room, Adanna exhaled, forcing herself to think. "I want to see a forensic audit," she said. The investigator scoffed. "A forensic audit?" "Yes." Her eyes locked onto his. "If you're so sure I'm guilty, then prove it. Trace the funds. Find the real recipient." The investigator hesitated for the first time. Then, his phone rang. He frowned and answered, listening intently. Adanna watched closely as his expression shifted. His brows furrowed. His grip on the phone tightened. He ended the call and turned, back to her. A moment of silence, then, his voice, quieter this time. "A new piece of evidence just surfaced, and something isn't adding up." Hope flickered in Adanna's chest. The tides were shifting. The investigator tapped his pen against the desk, his mind racing. The call had been brief, but enough to shake his confidence in the so-called airtight case against Adanna. A forensic analyst had flagged something strange. The funds linked to the alleged fraud didn't just vanish. They were traced to an offshore account in Tade's name. Adanna saw it. That flicker of doubt in the investigator's eyes. The first crack in the wall. She leaned forward. "Now you see it, don't you?" The investigator didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shuffled the papers in front of him, his gaze lingering on the transactions. "Who would benefit the most from removing me?" she continued, her voice low but firm. "Who had the motive? The opportunity?" Silence. Then the investigator exhaled and pushed back from the desk. "I need to make a call." He stood up and left the room, locking the door behind him. Adanna clenched her fists. It wasn't over yet, but this was the first step. Tade was in his office basking in his so-called victory when his assistant rushed in, panic written all over his face. "Sir, we have a problem." Todd turned, irritation flashing across his face. "What now?" His assistant hesitated, then handed him a report. "There's an internal audit being launched, and they've started looking into the offshore accounts." The color drained. From Tade's face. What? He hissed. His assistant swallowed hard. They found something. Tade gritted his teeth. He had been so careful. He had covered his tracks. How had they found out? A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he grabbed his phone. Damage control. He had to act fast. At the same time, Adanna sat in the interrogation room, waiting. The walls seemed to press in around her, but she remained still. Finally, the door swung open. The investigator returned, but this time his face wasn't as cold. Something had changed. He sat down, studying her. Then, he slid a different file toward her. Adanna hesitated before opening it. Inside, a copy of the offshore account records. Her heartbeat quickened. Tade's name. The transactions. The evidence. We're going to need you to make a statement, the investigator said. Because it looks like you were telling the truth. Adanna lifted her chin, her lips curling into the smallest of smiles. Tade thought he had buried her, but he had just dug his own grave.